Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining the final keynote of what has been a truly amazing conference. I am Gholam Khiabany, and I work in the Department of Media, Communication and Cultural Studies at Goldsmiths, University of London. I am delighted and honored to be chairing today's discussion. I am joined by Dr. Ghada Karmi. Ghada is a Palestinian physician, academic, and writer. She's a former research fellow and lecturer at the University of Exeter, and a long-standing political activist on Palestine. Amongst her best-known publications is her memoir, In Search of Fatima, published by Verso in 2002, a political analysis of a one-state solution entitled Married to Another Man, Israel's Dilemma in Palestine, published by Pluto in 2007, and a second memoir, Return, which was published by Verso in 2015. She has contributed a chapter on the subject of this talk to the book, which is Capitalism Conscious, 200 Years of the Guardian, recently published by Pluto Press, or rather this week. Ghada will be talking for about 35 minutes, and then we move on to Q&A. Please bear in mind, many of you are familiar now with the system, that on Hopin, all questions and comments will be on the chat. So sadly, no video or audio from people attending. If you would like to ask a question, please add it to the chat, and we will take as many as we can in the time we have. Ghada, I'm really glad you're here. Delighted to have you with us. The microphone is yours.
Thank you. And I tell you, I'm delighted to be here too. I want to thank Des and Becky and everybody who assisted them in setting up this wonderful conference. But I also have a special thanks for them for providing me with a platform at this conference, bearing in mind that I'm a Palestinian and that we live at a time when the climate of opinion in this country and in some other Western countries is not friendly towards Palestinians. Allow me a few moments personal reflection here about my own life. I'm what's called a 1948 Palestinian. That means I was born in Palestine before it became Israel. And we left our country for the reason of the establishment of the State of Israel. We ended up in Britain, and I can tell you that during the 1950s in this country, the word Palestine went out of use. I know it's extraordinary, it's amazing, but very quickly it went out of use. So that I can remember when people asked me where I came from and I said Palestine, they thought I said Pakistan. For some time after that, we became, quote, Arab refugees. Nobody knew who these Arab refugees were, where had they come from, etc. But we had kind of view. We had no voice until the 1970s, when things started slowly to improve. I remember how unimportant I felt, how illegitimate my case was. Somebody actually told me we Palestinians were sort of like squatters on Jewish land, that kind of thing. Now, that improved enormously over the years. And in the last 20 years, it's been much, much better. And I tell you, I don't want to go back to a time like that, which is something that I lived through and I never want to live through again. And I'm seeing it happening slowly via anti-Semitism, the slurs, the accusations of anti-Semitism. Our case, the Palestinian case, is becoming delegitimized. Our voice, people are nervous, they're intimidated to allow us a platform. I hope it doesn't get any worse than this. Now, in a funny way, that slightly mirrors my experience, slightly mirrors the Guardian's coverage of Israel-Palestine. People will know or may know that a long time ago, when C.P. Scott was the editor, and before that, actually, The Guardian supported Zionism, so much so that, in fact, at the time of Scott, 3 staff reporters were ardent Zionists at the time. Now, there was a prosperous Jewish community in Manchester, and the Manchester Guardian, as it was then, used to report on the affairs of this community. So there was already an awareness or a sympathy or an interest in Jewish affairs. Now, Scott became the editor in 1872 and went on being editor until 1929. In 1914, he met Chaim Weizmann. Chaim Weizmann was an immigrant, a Jewish immigrant from Russia, and an ardent Zionist and an advocate for Zionism. And this meeting had a tremendous effect on C.P. Scott. He fell under the spell of Zionism, and in no time became the ambassador, as it were, for Weizmann. He took him to meet leading politicians of the time, introduced him to the British cabinet. Of course, C.P. Scott was very well connected, and all these were made available to Chaim Weizmann. And in that way, Weizmann came to meet David Lloyd George, came to meet Arthur Balfour, of course, a very important meeting between them. So much so, you know, between 1915 and 1918, many articles appeared in the Manchester Guardian supporting Zionism. There was no question that this influence that Weizmann had affected Scott a lot and helped to pave the way for the Balfour Declaration of 1917. Now, on Scott's retirement, and a few years later on his death, and the editor William Crozier, the next editor, who had been a member of the Zionist group on the Manchester Guardian, carried on this pro-Zionist tradition. And so much so that the Guardian, the Manchester Guardian, became a tool of Zionist advocacy, really. Now, it would have probably stayed like that, except, of course, that historical events affected the Guardian and changed, it began to change. I'm thinking of the landmarks in Palestinian history, as, for example, in 1964, the PLO, the Palestine Liberation Organization, was established. And in 1965, Fatah, the major Palestinian organization within the PLO, mounted its first act of armed resistance against Israel. These activities increased, became more and more well-known, until by the late 1960s, the PLO became a cause célèbre. You might say a bit like the Spanish Civil War. Young men and young women flocked from very many parts of the world to join the PLO and fight for justice and liberation for the Palestinians. The Guardian was not unaffected by these changes, and Alistair Hetherington, who was the then editor, was moved to actually write a piece. I want to read an extract to you from, which in retrospect is amazing, from an editor of a paper which until not long before that had been extremely supportive of Zionism. Now, Alistair Hetherington wrote and I quote, "Return for the Palestinian refugees is no metaphor, unlike with the Jews. Whatever caused them to leave in the first place, the State of Israel was founded at their expense. If its population is to be enlarged, they have the first claim to be admitted. It would be an acknowledgement by Israel of its responsibility for the existence of the refugees and its duty to right their wrongs." Amazing to think that he wrote something so forthright at the time. Now, the 1967 war, Arab-Israeli war, happened and led to a time of tremendous adulation for Israel, triumphalism. Everybody thought Israel was brilliant and wonderful, and it defeated all these Arab armies. And The Guardian was part of that too, was part of those celebrations. However, as a result of Resolution 242, which was passed at the end of that war, 1967, the Guardian editor, again, still Alistair Hetherington, became interested in the idea of peacemaking between the Israelis and the Palestinians. He started to encourage the idea of cooperation towards negotiations, towards understanding each other's positions. And so really this was quite a change in view of what had gone before. This was the era, remember, we're coming into the era of Michael Adams, a Middle East correspondent for The Guardian for a while, who reported on the situation in terms that were very sympathetic towards the Palestinians. This was the time also of journalists like David Hurst, Martin Wilcott. These were people that we as Palestinians thought were our friends, or we looked on them as people who were sympathetic to us. Now, in the early 1970s, Palestinian solidarity organizations started to come into being in Britain. I just mentioned a few. The first British Palestinian medical charity, Palestinian Medical Aid, later to become Medical Aid for Palestinians, that is MAP, which people I think have probably heard of. There was an organization called Free Palestine, and there was a small group I set up with a few friends called Palestine Action, and we were the first lobbying group on behalf of the Palestine case. And we worked terribly hard and so on. So in the 1970s, things were beginning to change for the Palestinians. But of course, in 1974, Yasser Arafat gave his famous speech to the United Nations General Assembly, the gun and the olive branch. And following that, the Rabat Summit of Arab States recognized the PLO as the sole representative of the Palestinian people. Now, all these changes together had an effect on The Guardian as well. It became what we would have called a more friendly place to us, to our voice. Between 2002 and 2020, many articles, The Guardian published many articles by Palestinians, including myself. And I really want to mention, this was the time of Seamus Milne, who was the comment editor. This was the time of Becky Gardiner, who was later comment editor. We experienced these as friends, as people we could, not so much, it wasn't that they were partisan in the sense that they were on our side, as so many journalists were on the side of Israel. It's not like that. But they were at least receptive to our voices and the sorts of messages we wanted to put across. And of course, the 1970s saw the appointment of the first PLO representative to Britain, a man called Saeed Hammami, whom some older people may remember. Now, it then became the case that the Guardian was looked on as the address for Palestinians wishing to put across their point of view. And this really, in a way, is supported by a study, a very recent study by Ruth Sabido, who looked at the coverage of the Arab-Israeli coverage in the Times, the Mirror, the Mail, the Sun, and the Guardian, and came to gave evidence to show that the Guardian had the largest coverage of any of those papers of the Israeli-Palestine issue. Although between 2013 and 2015, Ben White, who did a study of how often Palestinians were published in The Guardian as opposed to Israelis, and he found that of all the articles that The Guardian published, 15% were by Palestinians, and nearly double that, 28% were by Israelis. However, even so, it was a very great improvement on our experience elsewhere. Now, in my experience, this, in very recent years, this has become a bit more difficult. It's become a bit more difficult to be published in The Guardian. What I've noticed is that while there is still the possibility for Palestinians to be, or the Palestinian voice to be heard, more and more it has become the case that these are voices from under occupation, which is perfectly valid, of course, but in other words, these are first-hand, almost reports, you might say, of conditions in the occupied territories. Much less so was The Guardian prepared to publish comment pieces by Palestinians not under occupation, so that it was much more the kind of articles that Palestinians like me would want to write and my colleagues would want to write would be more about the situation as a whole rather than a particular experience as is happening. Nevertheless, those sorts of articles are appearing. At the same time, there has been a tendency, an increasing tendency, for articles written by Israelis or Jewish writers to appear as if they were in place of Palestinian articles. That is, Israelis critical of Israel, that's what I mean, and Jewish writers critical of Zionism, as if they could really replace the Palestinian voice. Now, all in all, the Guardian's position on this whole issue became over time what you would call a classic liberal position. So today, I think it's accurate for me to say that these days, this is summed up by, now I want to find this other quote from a Guardian editorial. Yes, here's a Guardian editorial of 2017, which says the following. Balfour's original sin was to afford national rights to only one of the two peoples who claimed the land. This cannot be repeated. Palestinians need to be able to govern themselves in a state recognizable as such. The world's gaze will fall again on Israel and the condition of the Palestinians. To end 100 years of conflict, will need both sides to understand that neither can prevail through violence, peace can be built only by equitably sharing the land they both crave. Now, that sums up, I think, the Guardian position on this issue. And it's a position which, if you like, is saying something like neither side can lay claim to the whole land. Both have rights, and therefore they have to share it in their own, each in their own state. The Israelis have a moral justification for holding on to wanting to have their state, but the Palestinians need their state. Of course, the problem with all that is that the equitable, the sharing is not equitable, and you know the classic two-state solution is an 80-20% sharing. Now, nobody would deny that it is very difficult. This issue is inflammatory. It's problematic to cover for any journalist. Journalists normally use words with great care in case they get flack from both sides. Although the pro-Israel side has always been much more vociferous and much stronger, because there are various pro-Israel organizations in this country, and they use techniques which are quite disruptive, like email barrages and pressure of all sorts. A good example of a Guardian journalist who was harassed in this way is Suzanne Goldenberg, who Jewish journalist covering the West Bank to and sent back well-researched, quite reports talking about what had happened in the camp, where the Israeli army used various methods to said was quelling resistance and killed a lot of people. But of course, the problem with all that it made the harder and harder, because if people speak about what they actually see, but that immediately invites enormous amount. For example, Ewan McCaskill says this about his own experience. He said in January 2001, I wrote that the Israelis were behaving badly in the West Bank. Emails. Half of them were a quarter from Britain and a quarter from Israel. A month or two later, I wrote that it was not true that Israel had presented the at the peace talks in Taba, and I received hundreds of worse emails. And by the way, the Guardian's Jonathan Friedman, well-known pro-Israel commentator, had this to say: a lot of flack is hundreds of emails, many pure. Now, because of this situation, the Guardian commissioned Daphna, a reputable Israeli, to do a study of the Guardian coverage. And she published the results of her research in a book in 2004, and the book was called Disenchantment, The Guardian in Israel. Her research was thorough. It was detailed. She had access to any part of to the archives and to any journalist or any of the staff on the paper. And she came to the conclusion that there was no evidence that the Guardian was anti-Semitic or that it displayed anti-Zionism. However, this didn't help The Guardian. By this time, the pro-Israel lobbies had decided that The Guardian was anti-Semitic. The reason being that it was critical of some Israeli policies. That was enough. It became anti-Semitic, and despite the Daphna Baram study, it didn't help. It didn't help. And in fact, Alan Rusbridger, whom we heard this morning, at the time, seeing how this had worked out, had this to say: the vitriolic nature and extent of the counter-response is unparalleled, utterly disproportionate, cynical, and quite ugly. So the paper became labeled anti-Semitic, and there was no let-up for that. Now, what I want to move on to is to make an argument which I very strongly believe and which I want to put to you. You see, a lot of people are confused about what is called the Arab-Israeli conflict or the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. They really are confused. I come across people who don't know who's occupying who and think actually Palestinians are occupying Israelis and so on. Now, I, of course, do not mean an audience like this, which is interested and informed, but a lot of people genuinely don't know what has happened, and I don't blame them. And I don't blame them because what has been all wrong all along with the way this conflict is spoken about and presented is the fact that the framing is incorrect. It's framed incorrectly. It comes across as complicated, difficult, intractable. Those are the terms that are used about the situation between Israel and the Palestinians. And I think the time is long overdue for us to clarify this and to frame what's going on between Israel and Palestinians correctly as for what it is, not in this vague form of conflict. First of all, it is not a conflict. We are used to this term, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. It's not a conflict. There is no conflict between the Congolese and the Belgian imperialists. There was no conflict between the Algerians and France. These were colonized people fighting, resisting a colonizing power. That's what was happening there. And no less, I'm explaining, is what is happening in Israel, Palestine today. If we go back and look at history properly, we see that this is a Zionist settler colonial project. The Israeli project is a Zionist settler colonial project. It was enabled by Britain for its own imperial reasons at one time, and it went on to expel the natives, people like me, and replace them with new people in order to build a settler colony, which we call Israel. Now, in fact, there's an interesting quote from The Guardian itself, from a former senior leader writer, Frank Edmead, who said this: at the receiving end, Zionism looks like any colonial movement. Settlers flowed in to acquire eventually much of the land and all the political power. And that is indeed the story. Now, having expelled a large percentage of the natives, the project met resistance. That was inevitable. It met So what is called today the conflict is actually the resistance of the colonization. Now, in order for the architects of Israel to disguise these of what happened in Palestine, they've always had a very sophisticated PR exercise. And you know very many of these components. The biblical, the fact that the ancient Israelites related to modern European Jews in an unbroken chain, something completely historical and completely preposterous. But nevertheless, this is that's the mythology that's been displayed. In addition to that, distortions of history, facts has helped enormously. Take the example of the Nakba, 1948, when people like me were expelled for a very, very, very long time until some of its own historians, Israeli historians, the truth. The official story in Israel was that the Palestinians, they had orders from their leaders to run away, and they all ran away. So it's not to do with Israel, it was their leaders who were at fault. We know that in the last few years, the state archives, Israel's state archives, which have documented the Nakba, are now closed to researchers. Researchers cannot access these archives. And it is not a secret Israel was established. Indeed, it's one of its foremost historians, Benny Morris, who is a Zionist, in an extremely in a very famous interview with the Haaretz in 2000. I can find it. Yes, had this to say, and I quote, "This has to be, it is impossible to evade it. Without the uprooting, the Jewish state would not be here." So that is all well known. People like Benny Morris and many others, that kind of obfuscation was going on. Now, the PR exercise has not stopped for a minute because it has remained very important to disguise the truth of how it came to be and what it is, its true nature. Today, we have anti-Semitism, which has come into the service of the Israeli state, justifying what it does, justifying how it behaves towards this. Because if you criticize Israel, you are being anti-Semitic. This has been the achievement of International Remembrance Association's definition of anti-Semitism by governments, by some universities. That has been the instrument by which criticism of Israel equals anti-Semitism and Palestinian support, meaning that if you support Palestinians, you are anti-Semitic. This is working these days. On this note, I really would for on Palestine from now on to be like it is. This is old-fashioned settler colonialism. It quotes terrorism of the natives, of the Palestinians is resistance. That's what's really going on. Now, if we've got to call it conflict because that's what become accepted. If it had been presented as, then, for examples, the language would change and the way people's understanding then would change. So the Palestinian Authority becomes controlled Palestinian. Gaza becomes the Israeli besieged enclave of Gaza. The West Bank becomes colonized West Bank. Palestinian terrorism acts of Palestinian resistance. So overall, I would say that the Guardian's coverage of this very difficult issue is the fairest and most balanced of all the mainstream press in this country. It has earnestly sought to represent the views of both sides, but it accepts the basic parameters which show that the true nature of this conflict is still not appreciated. The basic parameters are that Israel was a moral necessity. There's nothing moral about setting yourself up in somebody else's country and at their expense. But it, nevertheless, this is the belief. It's a moral necessity. The offer of 20% of the original Palestine to the Palestinians to make their state on it is reasonable. And the fact that the refugees and the exiles, people like me, almost cannot return because they would disturb the, quote, ethnic balance. These are the parameters of the two-state solution, and that is what the peace process has been about. Now, the context of all this must be revised. Faulty thinking on this must go. Reporting needs to be honest. This is a settler state that has robbed the land of the native population and intends to take the rest. That's what it's about. And if that happened more often, if people understood it more often as that, I genuinely believe we would have found the start of the way towards a resolution of this terrible situation.
Ghada, for a wonderful overview, a brilliant kind of, in a way, tour de force of the history of the context, and in particular on the question of framing, as you put it, the conflict. I'm aware that there have been other studies, for example, most notably, well, not working on The Guardian in particular, but on the broadcast coverage of Palestine in a wonderful book by Greg Philo and Mike Berry, Bad News from Israel, in which precisely raises some of those questions in terms of the framing of the situation as you put it. I've got a number of questions in front of me. The first one is really a comment, but at the same time, reiterating the points you raise, finishing with a question that's from Robin, who says, the sense of moral outrage from The Guardian about the Palestinian Nakba, which is still ongoing, is deafening in its silence. Plus The Guardian's ignoring of leading left-wing Jewish intellectuals speaking out about abuses by the Israeli military mean The Guardian does not speak to me and many others. There will be yet another set of evictions on Palestinians in a few weeks in Sheikh Jarrah. Will The Guardian be reporting it with a sense of outrage? Any comment on that?
Yes, I mean, what can I say? I agree. And I mean, you know, putting it like that is absolutely spot on. Sense of outrage. People need to be outraged by this situation. You have a state that behaves in this way, that treats other human beings in this terrible way. Where's the outrage? I mean, the Nakba was bad enough, but as the questioner says, it's ongoing. We have these situations are ongoing. The Nakba didn't just happen and go away. It's going on. It's ongoing.
Another question by Colin Morell, who has asked, I would be interested to know if Ghada thinks there is a difference in the style of reporting of Israel-Palestine between The Guardian and the BBC, and in particular the World Service.
Good point. Good point. If anything, the BBC is really very disappointing. It's very disappointing. And many of us have despaired for a very long time of getting a fair hearing from the BBC, whichever of its countries. The Guardian, in that sense, comes off better. But, you know, there's always this issue which will have to be faced. I don't know who's going to have the guts to face it. It's to do with the fear of being accused of being anti-Semitic. This is the problem. As a result, media outlets have been neutered because they're nervous and they're scared. This has to be faced sooner or later. You cannot have free speech hostage to this anti-Semitism scare. Really, it has. In a way, you know, if you look back and you think about it, when it became a real issue, note it was 2015, 2016. We hadn't been hearing a lot about it. I know it was all 2015, 2016, the time when Jeremy elected leader of the Labour Party. And I think that really put a lot of energy into the campaign to anti-Israel activity of any sort, anti-Semitism.
Thank you. That is, of course, a very, very sore point, and quite, I think, for the journalists themselves and what they can report and what they cannot. Another question: can you speak to Nafiz Ahmed losing his Guardian blog after he reported on Israel's motivation for the occupation of Gaza being offshore gas? Are you familiar with that story?
Yeah, and of course, you see, the suppression of facts, the suppression, very, very serious, because, like what somebody says, isn't the same as saying, I won't listen to what they say. And this has become a really increasing problem. So it's an example of that are taking place in terms of speech, in terms of the facts. This morning, I spoke about the importance of facts for The Guardian, that it started off as it's distinctive, that it stuck to facts, as opposed to many other papers of the time, which were full of opinions. Facts are important. So, reality of this offshore gas, it belongs to doesn't belong to Israel. Nevertheless, Israel is helping itself as usual. Now, why can't you point that out? Why can't you say something is robbery and thievery and illegal and wrong? What kind of a world do we want? We'll call it what it is. But it's back to my thing with colonialism. You know, you can't call it. Israel is a settler colony. That's what it is. Now, you can't do that because people don't like it. And so you've got to start talking about something else and calling it something else. The Gaza, a story all of its. It's deeply worrying. And Lord Ahmed should never have at all.
Thank you. Another question from who says colonial settler violence is increasing like never before. Scenes of settlers at Damascus Gate chanting death to Arabs, dozen injured, many hospitalized. When will The Guardian report this? And if they won't, why not?
Yeah, I couldn't agree. My thoughts are in Jerusalem, because, of course, and really, if this was taking place anywhere else, you'd call it fascism. You'd call these people who shouldn't be out on the streets. You know, how come this kind of thing can happen? And they that outrage, using the term. It's The Guardian must, because there is a difference. I mean, I had made the point that The Guardian was better than the other newspapers in this country. It has to demonstrate, because you go on demonstrating that it is better. These riots are unacceptable. And yes, you see, there's something, the elephant in the room is the thing we are unwilling to talk about. And that is this manufacture, anti-Semitic threat, that there's anti-Semitism everywhere. You know, it has to be corrected, it has to be shown, not because there is no anti-Semitism. Of course there is, but not to this, not that every time you open your mouth, say something about Israel or anti-Semitic. This is a false equivalence. Anti-Semitism has nothing to do political state. Israel is a state. So the fact that you might criticize the actions of a state has nothing to do with. So that has to be. Nobody will actually look it in the face and is scared and doesn't want to have to suffer the consequences. Then this will all go on.
Alan has asked, BBC in Jerusalem is trying to present it as both sides responsible. Any comments on that?
Yeah. This is an old, the same as when or whatever calls on both sides. It's both sides, but we're back again to the faulty framing. You don't equal responsibility between a colonizing power and that is not equivalent. If you go on reporting this conflict as if there were some equivalence, that you've got two sides here in a fight, and one side, this side is a little bit worse than the other. So long as you go on doing that, we'll go on arguing, you know, no, I'm not worse than you, you're worse than me. Now, this is not equivalent. It's not a talk about bad behavior on both sides. You have a victim and you have a dominant force. And a dominant force is occupying, has invaded, put itself as the ruler of a land that does not belong to it. So, I mean, in that, once you framed it like that, you don't talk about they're as bad as each other, etc.
I just wanted to raise another issue, because I think that's been quite central in your analysis of Palestinian situations and what has been happening, and that is to do with the question of return and question of borders. I'm kind of in a way trying to somehow, perhaps if I can, maybe it's not a kind of in a way great analogy, but looking at the much of the coverage about migrations and refugees and all of that, a significant focus has been on the movements of the people. But of course, we're looking at the kind of in a way debate about raising a wall between Mexico and United States, or creation of many walls within Fortress Europe. In much of the discussions about movements of the people, it's usually represented as movements of people over the border, rather than movements of border over the people. So you kind of, in a way, historically looking at the case of empire. One significant examples, of course, is the case of slavery, or the annexing of much of the West Indies and certain parts of Pacific to the United States. So I'm looking at the map of Palestine and how the borders actually have moved over the people since Nakba, and looking at the map, actually how that map has shrunk. So that is one really interesting paradox, and how that has been reported by The Guardian and by the media. But related to that is the question of the paradox of the return of Palestinians being allowed to their homes, to their country, to the place in which they were born, including yourself, coming from Jerusalem. And this is also happening at the time that a significant number of publications and media and politicians constantly moan about refugees and migrants coming to Europe or coming to the United States and being asked to go back to where they come from. And here we have millions of Palestinians who want to do exactly that, and they're not allowed. So how could we understand the kind of in this paradox? In what way the coverage of the media really has, as you put it, kind of in a way framed it, but also kind of in a way turned the whole situation upside down?
I mean, the refugees, the question of the Palestinians is at the heart of the Palestinians. If you wanted to point to one single issue which all Palestinians feel very strongly about, was justice. That is the refugee issue. Far between million are registered with UNRWA in camps. Add to that several million, like me, who are not, but are in exile also. Now, the heart issue for us has been that we were expelled from our homeland, and whenever allowed, again, complicated, not allowed because it didn't suit us. Worked hard to create a settler colony for it. Is the nation coming, spoiling the ethnic purity of the state that they've created. So we know very well why they're doing it. The question then is one of power, really. If you're in a position, you, Israel, are in a position to make your will superior to dominate rights, justice, humanity, all the rest of it, then you can do it. Then you do it. So it's not at all mysterious. What an irony that Western countries are desperate to offload, go back to where they came from. The Palestinians are desperate to go back to where they came from, and they're not. Yes, I mean, what can I say except to stress again? This is wrong. The whole story here is wrong. It was Britain to a settler movement to move in somebody else's country. It was wrong for the states to go on supporting who sat so unfairly and that was wrong, and or help Israel to continue exerting its influence, etc., to allow it to produce these various devices for holding criticism at bay, the latest of which is the manufacture of the anti-Semitism scare. That's the latest. So what is wrong is that Israel is allowed to do this. And, you know, I don't want us to part with any kind of idea that all one does is complain and rant as a Palestinian. But the reality is the situation is extremely wrong. It should not be allowed to continue. And really, I do feel that Western power try and somehow for the dreadful wrongs that they've inflicted on the Palestinian people. And they can is we don't accept you as you are, and media organize newspapers to reflect that view for a change and of the victor and of the winner.
There are two related questions that have been asked. One of them is by Rosie, who says, there have never been covert operation and collusion between anti-Semitism campaign. There have been covert operations and collusions between anti-Semitism campaign and the Jewish Chronicle and Board of Deputy with the centrist and right-wing politicians. The Guardian has never really admitted that they too went along with it. In this context, the framing who long for is not going to happen. Related to that, also another questions from Ines Newman, accepting the colonization argument and that there is no equivalence between Israel and Palestinians' action, isn't there a danger that if you frame all Palestinian actions as resistance, this removes any possibility of critical analysis of Palestinian actions? So two separate, but perhaps to some extent related questions. I also wanted, perhaps if you could say something about the reality of what has happening. I mean, we all know that, for example, the Israeli states have been quite happy to roll the red carpet for some well-known anti-Semite, including in the opening of the US embassy in Jerusalem. What sort of a damage that does in a fight against anti-Semitism itself as part of a broader struggle of anti-racism?
Yeah. Yes, all very good, very relevant, good questions. The thing is, anti-Semitism has been known for. This was how the derived a lot of support because without anti-Semitism, you think about it, without anti-Semitism, what for Jews to say, Jewish victims themselves, we need a state of our own. We need to deal with this terrible by moving off. So anti-Semitism was always crucial to the creation, the maintenance of the idea that Israel has to continue as a safe haven for Jews. And this relationship is deeply worrying. It's something that, you know, people more. Now, in terms of are all actions, Palestinian actions, all actions of resistance and so on, I really understand that question because some of the actions that Palestinians have taken would be classic terrorism. That is, they are targeting civilians or civilians. That's right. But I suppose to put succinctly, as a whole, as Palestinians against Israel resistance as a whole. That doesn't mean every single act could not be classified, would be classified as terrorism. No, I don't think so. But these things happen. I remember, by the way, in 2005, I was in Ghana, and I spoke to a leader, and I put this point to him. Suicide bombings, which affect civilians, actually, wouldn't you call this terrorism? You know, his answer was, said, if we could get at their soldiers, their army, we would prefer to do this out of the soldiers, but they're too well protected. And the second thing he said was this: why does nobody ever ask that when they drop on us, the vast majority of the victims, why does nobody ever point this out? Why is it just us? So,
thank you so much, Ghada. Sadly, we are out of time. Huge thank you to Ghada for her presentation and for her contribution, and to all of you for joining us and being part of this really important conversation that we've had now, as well as in the past day and a half. And finally, please join me in expressing appreciations of organizers for putting together and running such a brilliant event. Thank you to all of them. And now the final words from my colleague, Des Friedman, who has been one of the organizers of this event. Des, the microphone is yours.
Thank you so much, Gholam. Thank you, Ghada, for a brilliant talk and a great chapter in Capitalism's Conscience as well. I know that everyone wants to leave their laptop, phone, whatever it is, and get out in the sunshine. So I just want to say I think it's been a brilliant couple of days. I have learnt a lot myself. I have some fantastic quotes, historically, contemporary as well. But really, now is the time just to thank people. So obviously, from Becky and I, as the co-organizers, wanted to thank the student volunteers. Honestly, without their patience and their flexibility and their commitment, this would not have taken place as it has. So to Neve, to Cladda, to Paloma, and to Felix, huge thanks. And I hope you've enjoyed it. And above all, to Stephanie Rodriguez, who's hiding backstage somewhere as the conference administrator. If anyone out there is trying to organize an online conference, I suggest that you steal Stephanie as soon as you can before she goes off to do a PhD somewhere else. But again, from me and Becky, we can't thank Stephanie enough for all the work she has done. These debates will run and run. I do hope there's going to be another publication arising out of the wonderful papers that have taken place. I hope you spend Saturday night, or I hope if you're teaching students, you raise some of these arguments about liberalism, about journalism, about what difference media can make, and that we will reconvene in person in the future. For now, thank you so much for joining us.